Baltimore City Council Ways and Means Committee, we're back in session for Council Bill 21-0080, the ordinance of estimates for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2022. Our 12:30 session, which is going to go through 2:30 p.m., is going to cover the American Rescue Plan, ARP funding. I'm Eric Costello, Councilman for the 11th District, Chair of the committee. I am joined by Councilman Antonio Glover, 13th District, Councilman Chris Burnett, 8th District, member of the committee, Councilman Mark Conway, 4th District, Councilwoman Odette Ramos, 13th District, Councilman Robert Stokes, 12th District, member of the committee, Councilman Isaac Yitzi Schleifer, 5th District, member of the committee, Councilman Zeke Cohen, 1st District, Councilman Ryan Dorsey, 3rd District, member of the committee. I think that's everyone. Council Vice President Middleton is going to be a little late joining us. We have, on behalf of Mayor Brandon Scott, Natasha Meehue, and Nina Themlis, on behalf of Council President Nick Mosby, we have Matt Stegman and Nikki Thompson. Staff to the committee is Marguerite Curran, and we have Bob Seneme and Aaron Moore with us from the Bureau of Budget and Management Research. Mr. Moore, please take it away. Or actually, give me 1 second. So, colleagues, I'm going to give a little background on this portion. Also recognize Daniel Ramos, who's the Deputy City Administrator. So he has oversees finance and BBMR for the administration. The purpose of this session, I know there are a lot of questions around the American Rescue Plan funding, how the administration plans to use that funding. Everyone on the council should have been briefed already on some an initial framework on how the administration plans to carry out the use of funding for this. I know that there are several places in the budget where there are agencies that are not adequately funded. And I think that's something that everyone on the council can agree with, whether we're talking about planting more trees in forestry or having more funding for maintenance of our parks or of our streets or whatever the case may be. So I wanted to make sure that we focused a session dedicated to ARP funding so that we can avoid questions at later sessions where something is short funded and we're asking an agency head, for example, Rec and Parks with respect to planting more trees. I want to avoid us asking them questions like, well, why don't you just use ARP funding? So this is going to be essentially the time for us to ask those questions and understand the process. So with that, Mr. Moore, please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the council. It's always an honor to be in front of you. I'm going to begin sharing my presentation here today. And basically, to let everyone know, yes, we're talking about the recovery funds. We'll talk briefly about the CARES Act. You all received much of that information from Bob last Friday, but we'll just do a brief review. You all have also been briefed, but also for the public knowledge as well, give a basic overview of ARP, kind of the ground rules and what that means for the city, and also talk about eligibility as we've received some additional guidance from Treasury recently. We'll also talk about funding availability, the spending pace, project timeline and life cycle, and the application process. A lot to get through, but it will be succinct and comprehensive for your background and information. So to start off with CARES Act, the city received $103.6 million in relief funds. We've used 14.7 last year. In addition to that, we're estimated to use 64.4 this year. And then we have budgeted in FY2022 budget 24.5 million, which adds up to the 103 over the 3 fiscal years. So these funds have largely been used for pandemic expenses like personal protective equipment, medical services, and telework infrastructure. The funding has also been used for community economic support such as grants. All of the funds in relation to CARES Act spending have been spent or are already committed. So to jump into the American Rescue Plan, Baltimore City is set to receive $641.2 million. The city has already applied for the first tranche, which will be $320.6 million, and then the second tranche will arrive within the next year. The deadline to obligate these funds is December 31, 2024, which falls mid-fiscal 2025 for the city.
Aaron, I'm sorry to interrupt. You cut out there for a second. You said 641, right? There it is in the presentation. Got it. Thank you.
That is correct. 641.2 million. We also expect the public school system to receive their own allocation, whether directly or from the state. We're actively looking into that information. And also, as we know, the state has announced that they will receive $4 billion from the state fiscal recovery fund, and also additional $170 million from the capital projects fund, of which a portion could flow to the city for various initiatives from the state funding received by the American Rescue Plan. So the eligible uses for American Rescue Plan Act funds are pretty extensive, but also pretty limiting in that regard. So first and foremost, to support the public health response. That is the reason why we have these funds. Next, to replace public sector revenue loss, which is due to result of the recession that accompanied the pandemic. And then also, the law lists various topics for eligibility, which include premium pay, water and sewer infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, and there's also a critical focus on equity in the law, which is also a focus of the mayor. Transfers can also be made to private nonprofits. So with that, there's also another category here, which says to address negative economic impacts. That is fairly broad, but I'd like to share with you some of the additional guidance we recently received from Treasury on this topic. So these are meant to be examples that were listed in the Treasury guidance. They may or may not represent projects that may be pursued by the city. However, as they talk about addressing negative economic impacts, we're talking about delivering assistance to workers and families. And also, please bear in mind that these guidelines were written for both states and local governments, support to unemployed workers and survivors benefits, small business assistance like the city has been doing with CARES Act, such as loans and grants, and also direct aid to impacted industries. We know tourism has taken a dive here in Baltimore, particularly our hotel tax and such, and also hospitality and other sectors in the restaurant industry that may be impacted by the pandemic. There's also a provision here when it comes to addressing negative economic impacts of rebuilding public sector capacity. So staff that was lost due to the pandemic and rebuilding that back up to pre-pandemic levels. And they also put a specific emphasis on building capacity to implement the economic relief programs and also have a focus on data analysis when restoring these positions as well too, to help support the distribution of the funds. So this gives you an idea of what is allowed, but there are some very specific prohibitions within the law as well too, that I'll cover here on this slide. So no extraordinary deposits into a pension fund, cannot be used to fund debt service, cannot be used to fund legal settlements or judgments. Also, one of the provisions that came to a shock to many local governments and states was that these funds are not allowed to be deposited into any financial reserves or to replenish rainy day funds. This money is meant to be spent. There is also prohibition on general infrastructure spending, and there's select guidance on that. So just to be clear, this has to be, of course, related to the pandemic or the uses outlined within the guidance. So this isn't the type of funding we would use to just pave roads with. Although that is a great need in the city of Baltimore, it would not be an eligible use of the funds of the American Rescue Plan. Any use of funds that is ineligible will require a repayment to the Department of Treasury. So to talk a little bit in the grand scheme of what the 641, how it will be used from a 30,000 foot level. As you know, we reserved a specific portion, 141 million of the 641 for budget stabilization. In fact, 50 million of that is expected to be used this year to close out fiscal 2021 due to revenue shortfalls. In addition to that, more specifically on the budget stabilization, that 141 total amount, or 130 in particular, is subject to change based on the pace of recovery. So if we find that we do not need to use those funds, which is unlikely at this point due to our first year's use of those funds, we would put that back into the bucket, if you will, for projects. So there's also some funding for administration over the duration of the funding, and that includes the creation of the Office of Recovery Programs and some support there to fund the life cycle of the funding. So all in all, for funding that is remaining for projects will be about $500 million. Now, how do we intend to spend these funds, or how fast, if you will? So we expect spending to be swift and sensible, but it will change based on the nature of the projects that we receive through the application process. So high-cost eligible projects could be approved at any point in time. Funds will, of course, be spent in critical areas quickly in order to generate the economic impact that the city needs in order to recover. But also, funding could be held back based on the availability and complementary nature of other sources. So, for example, as we mentioned up top, the state is receiving $170 million in capital project funding, as well as $4 billion. We'll want to look at what of that potential source could come from the city of Baltimore. In addition to that, there are numerous provisions within the American Rescue Plan Act that could provide funds to Baltimore, such as that the council is aware of, such as the $15 billion for assistance to our unhoused citizens. In addition to that, Congress is working on legislation for what I believe is called the American Jobs Plan, or an infrastructure bill, which could also provide additional funding to Baltimore that we may seek to complement with the 641. So we want to be judicious about our spending, but also swift when applicable for critical areas and impacted industries. The majority of funds are intended to be obligated by fiscal 2023. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, we expect to use about 50 million of the budget stabilization this year for closeout. And at this time, no decisions have been made while the guidance is being reviewed and interpreted. However, we do have projects that are being considered at this time, but no decisions have been made. So I want to talk a little bit about the projects and the project timeline and life cycle. So there is a project minimum of $250,000. However, we intend to make smaller amounts available through our partners and trusted institutions like BCF, Baltimore Civic Fund, and also Baltimore Development Corporation, which would run grant programs on behalf of the city for smaller amounts. Each project will have 4 phases, and each phase has its own requirements. There is the application phase, there's the funding phase, administration, and closing. So to talk a little bit about the application phase, and I'll go into this on another slide a little bit more in depth, but I want to kind of frame this with a context so that folks can understand. So we want folks to think of the application phase like a mortgage. There are 2 parts to this application phase, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, but just to let folks know, we intend to announce projects later in the summer, and if there's anything deemed critical, we will of course get that money out as expeditiously as we possibly can. So to frame this application process, I want you to think of it as a mortgage application. So if an individual were to apply for a mortgage, they would go online, they would enter their name, their address, their income, their social, and then that would be the first step. And then someone would come back to you, a loan officer, and they would ask for your assets, liabilities, 1040s, W-2, and have you complete a full application, basically go through underwriting. This is a similar process to that. There is a proposal or letter of intent, and then there is a detailed application where we flush out the details. So the proposal is a short, concise, high-level overview of your project that is self-assessed for eligibility. It is carefully considered, but it is not fully planned. A successful proposal is not a commitment to fund a project. Just as if you were to put your information on that online portal, that does not mean the mortgage company is going to give you a mortgage. You then move on to the application phase. That is where you create a detailed implementation plan of your project, and you'll have the assistance of an application advisor or kind of like a loan officer, if you will. And then that will be reviewed and approved, and then that is where you kind of get your commitment to fund after your application is approved. And to talk about, so part of the process is having a review team score the proposal. This kind of details a high-level overview of the scoring criteria. Our reviewers will, of course, get additional training on this, and there is actually additional information in the application instructions on how these points are awarded that's available on the website. But there is detailed guidance in the application and instructions on how to put forth a great project. So, such as describing the project clearly. What is it and what will it do? A business case for the public good. That doesn't always mean savings in revenue, but for the public good. Describing success. What will this project produce? What will it change? What outcomes will change over time based on this? How will we improve the lives of citizens? Does it have a budget? Like, you know, tell us how much it would cost to implement such a project. And also equity. In policy and in implementation, it is also the highest weighted category, and we're looking at all forms of equity. This scoring criteria is based on best practices and also peer cities as well, and we are very excited to, look at our projects in a comprehensive manner, in addition to the full process that will be carried out when individuals or organizations apply. So how will we categorize these projects? There are a number of categories from Treasury that I mentioned a little bit earlier, which will also be assigned throughout the process. But the city also has a way of measuring, if you will, and classifying projects, internal and external, capital and operating, which falls amongst the priority outcomes listed in the budget. This is what the city is most familiar with. There is no set allocation amongst the priorities, but pulled directly from the budget, youth, public safety, equitable neighborhood development, clean and healthy communities, and also responsible stewardship of city resources. So I'm just going to go through a little bit each one of these outcomes and kind of define them and provide general examples of what a potential project may look like. So for example, prioritizing our youth. We really want to make sure that we're connecting our projects to the pandemic in a meaningful way and addressing the effects of that public health emergency, which includes our youth and addressing the effect of the pandemic on youth development and welfare. And of course, there's additional Treasury guidance on this. And, one of those things could include programs to address learning loss, public safety, enhancing and scaling violence prevention and response and monitoring and communication efforts. There are many things that could go into this bucket as well, as also classified by the Department of Treasury and their guidance. And such a thing could include community violence intervention programs. For equitable neighborhood development, this is really cutting across and delivering resources directly to communities to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. So such as, which is things we have done before and also mentioned in Treasury guidance, such as assistance to small businesses and nonprofits in various forms. Responsible stewardship of city resources. This is where we really talk about making the investments in the city's administrative infrastructure and operations and assets to improve future outcomes that may have been affected by the pandemic. So as we talk about restoring services and positions due to COVID-19 reductions that may have been lost. And of course, clean and healthy communities, which is really the heart of our response to the pandemic. Direct response, reopening, and also additional public health measures that could protect us. And this includes things like medical supplies, PPE, and also the vaccination programming that the city has stood up. And so with that, I'd like to, of course, first point folks to where they can find additional information. The draft application instructions are up at arp.baltimorecity.gov. The application portal is now open to agencies. We will soon be opening and extending an opportunity to apply to external organizations later in the summer. And also on this website, you'll find a general overview of the law and where more resources can be found. And in the future, this site will continue to be built out with additional information. And the city has also set up an inbox where individuals can send their inquiries, if they have any, at arp@baltimorecity.gov. And that, Mr. Chair, will conclude my presentation at this time.
Thank you. Can we take the presentation down, please? Okay. We've also been joined by Council Vice President Sharon Middleton from the 6th District, Councilwoman Danny McCray from the 2nd District, both members of the committee. Colleagues, questions? Go to the colleagues. Councilman Dorsey and then Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Aaron, for the presentation. I think when I was briefed on this, there was kind of some discussion of like, we don't want to add a whole lot of new services, things that would, like by adding a bunch of new positions that didn't exist before, because it's not intended to create new things that we would then have to sustain for, the indefinite future. But you did mention in your presentation restoring hiring, previous hiring levels and things like that. I'm wondering about a couple operations or in DOT that have had their that have had position freezes, as well as are kind of underpaid and face chronic challenges in hiring because they're not paying competitively enough. Would so are is a proposal, could a proposal be like, let's unfreeze certain positions, and can we do a salary increase for certain other positions in order to increase hiring? I'm thinking specifically of like towers. Right now we have 16 positions and we're about to have only 8 of them filled, and we have no luck hiring new towers for the city.
So sure, I'll address, there are 2 parts to this question here. So what would a proposal look like for something like this? One, the city will, and the budget office in particular, will be releasing guidance to city agency heads and fiscal officers about the process to restore positions lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic and any associated reductions to the budget. So that will be in advance of making a proposal. So we'll release that guidance to agencies to begin restoring services. proposals, and I would also comment on the salary as well. So we have existing internal processes through HR for equity and also compensation studies to ensure that we're paying workers the appropriate amounts. And I would encourage the agency to work with DHR to do a classification study to ensure that they're meeting the needs appropriately of those employees and also the market, most respectfully, to ensure that the city is meeting its needs. So for one, we will be releasing information where agencies can restore positions. And two, I would encourage internal processes to take place before a proposal. And actually, this brings up a good point. I would actually like to kick it over to Bob to kind of explain what this funding really means for the city in the grand scheme.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And just to Councilman Dorsey, to address your question, the idea of setting aside some money to restore services does not mean that we're going to go back and restore everything that was done cut in the fiscal 21 budget, because we can come nowhere close to affording that. What we're planning to do is to send out guidance to agencies and say, look, we understand that we had to take significant cuts last year in the 21 budget. Are there any very high priority things for you as an agency that you lost in that fiscal 21 budget that you would choose to restore? We're going to set an amount aside for those. It's not going to be a big number. Remember, if we restore it, we're going to have to restore it for 3 to 3.5 years with these funds until we recover and our recurring revenues can support those programs. So what we're describing, what Aaron and I are describing on that recurring cost restoration is going to be very narrow in the broad scheme of these funds. And I think to your earlier point about avoiding recurring costs, I think hopefully that should be obvious to folks. But we're going to have to choose projects that we can scale up and scale down very quickly. In my experience here, we haven't been very good about building things in and then building them back out over time, because another need comes up and an agency absorbs those positions to do something else. But in this case, this is a clear influx of money that will go completely away. So the idea will be just restore things that were absolutely critical, and the things you mentioned might fall into that category, or do these one-time type investments that you can scale up and scale down very quickly that have the biggest impact as possible on the city overall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My other question is about the use for water infrastructure. Would that include stormwater improvements such as removal of impermeable surface area and conversion to permeable surface area?
Sure. I believe what you've described would potentially be eligible. And I would also add that the department, has a robust effort and number of projects in the pipeline that are already being completed. And with these funds overall, I think the city is, of course, aiming to do great things and, of course, respond to the pandemic, but also make sure that we're being strategic in a way that allows us to generate potentially savings over time or revenue, but that does not have to be the case in all projects. And of course, make an impact on the long-term future. So that definitely indicates that stormwater infrastructure, and as the law calls out, that type of infrastructure would indicate that it is approved, and the department, of course, has existing resources that are dedicated to that and a robust effort to meet their MS4 permit requirements. So, we're also looking for opportunities to, like I said, shore up our long-term fiscal health, which includes, general fund targeted investments as well, too.
Thank you. I have other questions. I'll wait till the next round. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Would ARP funds be eligible to use to reduce the backlog at Forestry in terms of planting new trees and tree pruning, et cetera?
You know, I think it's worth looking into researching it and seeing which category it would fall in based on, you know, either Treasury and also how it best serves the criteria to be a competitive project. I would encourage the department to send it through the proposal process and also to self-assess for eligibility based on the guidance that has been released not only from Treasury but from finance in the interim.
Off the top of your head, Mr. Moore, can you think of any reasons why an infusion of funding to plant trees or to trim down that backlog, I guess pun intended, would not qualify?
Well, first and foremost, we want to address the needs of the pandemic and look at what those potential categories are. So we're seeing support the public health response, negative economic impacts, infrastructure. So if I will say this, there are provisions in the law related to equity-focused services. So where are these trees located? Is it contributing to maybe stormwater remediation as well by planting those trees? So I think there's a number of factors that we want to look into, and for the department to form a strong proposal based on the criteria outlaid and thinking about equity potentially and how it could potentially be considered water or sewer infrastructure to assist with those efforts. And also there are some provisions in the law about creating healthy environments for children as well, and other provisions in the law that are related to equity that may potentially be able to fit this project. But I think it warrants further research at this time.
Thank you. I want to talk in a little bit about that process a little bit more for the agency submissions, but I've already hit my 2 questions. We've been joined by Council President Mosby and Councilman Mark Conway from the 4th District. Mr. President, do you have any questions, sir?
No, Mr. Chair, at this time, I don't have any questions.
Thank you. We will go Burnett, Conway, Ramos, and Cohen. Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only quick question I had was around at essence during the briefing, if the funding could be used to avoid the water bill increase scheduled for July of this year.
Sure. There is actually provisions within the law itself there's a revolving fund that water utilities can access, and we have asked DPW to look more closely into that funding in particular. I believe it is, off the top of my head, $500 million nationwide, of which could come to Baltimore potentially through the State Department of the Environment. I don't remember the details exactly, but there are provisions about using the funding for helping individuals afford water. And as I mentioned, we'd want to tie that specifically to the pandemic, those affected, and we've done that, I believe, last year around this time. We made additional exceptions to enroll in the BH2O program if individuals became unemployed due to the pandemic. So I believe the focus of the law at this time is on providing affordability and assistance. I would also say that there have been provisions that prohibit us from doing tax cuts. That was mentioned in the eligibility, and we're looking more into where that applies and specifically, but previously it did state no change of administrative interpretation or law that will reduce net tax revenue or tax cut in shorthand, and backfilling with ARP for an administrative change or interpretation of that such may not be an eligible use, but providing assistance to those who cannot afford water or maintain that service may be an eligible use.
Got it. That makes sense. That was the only question I had for this round, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Conway?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to actually piggyback on your question, and if Mr. Moore, if you can give us a little bit of insight on what the infrastructure restrictions are, and try and maybe color it with some examples of a project that would work and a similar project that would not work under the infrastructure restrictions. I know it seems like there's a little bit of nuance here.
Yes, you're absolutely correct, and thank you for that question. So I believe the exact language is general infrastructure spending is not covered outside of water, sewer, broadband investments or above the amount allocated under the revenue loss provision. So what exactly does that mean? So any infrastructure related to water, sewer, and broadband is fair game, number one. Number two, any infrastructure related for operating purposes as responding to the pandemic is related. So I believe one of the examples listed in the guidance was HVAC systems and health-related facilities. So that would be related. I think what we're looking for in projects and to conform with eligibility is a tie to the pandemic, either directly or indirectly. So we're talking about potentially permanent building improvements that provide for social distancing or allow spaces to be reopened safely. We're looking at building improvements like that would be eligible. However, as we talk about general infrastructure, what would not be covered? Things that likely do not have a direct or indirect, or very short, window there to the pandemic. So paving roads will likely not be eligible. I don't want to speak in absolutes. So that something like that would not be eligible, or larger scale infrastructure operations on bridges or other type of large infrastructure or capital projects. But to also clarify on that too, there's also a time restriction. These funds have to be obligated within by December 31, 2024. So that means contract in hand and executed, and hopefully the project is complete by then as well too. So we of course are still researching the guidance. It was 150 pages from Treasury for the interim final rule, and we will continue to provide additional information and answer questions. I encourage anyone who is not a council person here today to email arp@baltimorecity.gov, and also to take a look at the website and refer to the application instructions for general background. I think just to close, I think one of the observations that was made in the application instructions, indirect opportunities may count as well. We know, for example, that many communities lack green space, and we know that the pandemic, really allowed people to rediscover the jewels that are city parks and that green space. So there may be a potential opportunity there. We're researching this information actively, but to do things such as the Green Network Plan or other plans that the city may have that can be, and implement things from design books and pattern books that may be accomplishable within the time frame.
That helps a lot. Thank you. My other question was with regard to the change in the estimated amount of money we would receive, and now the money we understand and receive, from $670 million to $641. How does that reduction affect the budget and the preliminary plans for distribution?
Sure. So first, to kind of clarify why that it was an estimate, the 670.3 was an estimate, and now the 641.2, we know that for sure. Now that Treasury has released allocations. The reason for that is twofold. One, the Treasury, from our understanding, changed the formula a little bit, and they added in about 145 additional jurisdictions so that they would have eligibility for funds for the CDBG portion of the funds. That's based on that formula. So they added in about 150 additional metropolitan areas, which decreased funding overall. And in addition to that, they used the ACS, American Community Survey information for 2019, of which would likely show, I believe, that Baltimore had a decreased population slightly. So it's mainly the addition of the 145 additional entities, which has decreased that amount. I think the city is still in an excellent place, a good place when it comes to those funds. We are confident in our budget stabilization number, and that we can still continue to fund projects that will be transformational for the city and its citizens and change outcomes in an equitable manner.
Okay, thank you. Those are my two questions.
Thank you. Ramos?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the committee and Mr. Moore. Two things. One is, just to be clear, the application process that you just described is both for agencies as well as community development type of organizations. Is that correct?
The structure and framework and the basics of the application process will be virtually the same. There will be some small changes for external organizations, but they're to conform with regulations and legal requirements. So, for example, the Code of Federal Regulations that we're following that is related to these funds require us to do subrecipient monitoring and risk assessments and things like that. So we will ask those organizations to complete that documentation so that we conform with the Code of Federal Regulations. However, they will still do the same process. Yes, they'll fill out their risk assessment first and then do their proposal. And if their proposal is successful, go on to the full application and implementation plan.
And you're going to send all that out when it's ready so we can circulate around, correct?
Yes, because
Yeah.
of those changes to, with the CFR and to make sure that we're conforming, we're still working on those processes and documentation and what that will look like for external organizations, but it will be the same portal and the same basic framework, correct?
Okay, great, thanks. And my second piece is, and I think the council has heard me talk about this, the framing of the budget, both the big budget that we have and how you're going to be looking at allocations, where it says equitable neighborhood development, the categories underneath there are very business and tourism focused. Now, we do need to invest in our businesses, no question. However, the sort of jargon of neighborhood equitable development actually means that we need to invest in areas that traditionally are not invested in. So I'm just asking for us to consider that. And I think that's when you had said that your point spread is 20 for equity. But when we're talking about that particular topic, because housing is kind of lost in, and community development is kind of lost in clean and safe communities and all of that. To me, that's what this is. It needs to be, that particular topic needs to be about investing in areas that traditionally do not get invested in our Black and brown communities. So having said that, will you and can you provide us, as this process is moving forward, a map of where the investments are going in real time so that we can monitor that it truly is being done in an equitable way?
So I would say this to answer your question, I believe that, well, one, the mayor's vision for this funding is, of course, equity-based, equity first, and through an equity lens. And that, of course, is something that he began as a councilman and as council president and now as the mayor. There's a strong commitment to equity on behalf of the administration, and that filters all the way down. And also transparency. We've set in a number of policies in advance that we're working on actively to ensure that these funds are transparent and visible, and so that people can touch them. And we're also going to measure them. And it will be across all types of activities, not just, business grants or any of the such, or support to nonprofits, but also touching our communities in a real way. And also, I would like to just, be clear that there is an aggressive recruitment for HR right now to stand up this office, the Office of Recovery Programs, which will be headed by the Chief Recovery Officer. So there will be a point of contact. Finances here, because of our experience and diligence and, working with federal aid and managing not only CARES Act, but FEMA as well too, and understanding the guidance of the American Rescue Plan. But there will be an office, if you will, to have this information prepared and available to the council and also to the public.
Thank you. That's the first I'm hearing of the recovery office. So I guess an announcement's coming, or maybe I missed it. But I just to say that I think a map of really understanding where the investments are going and holding the office accountable to real equity is going to be very important. So you didn't commit to that, but what I'm asking very specifically is that from this new office. Thank you.
Aaron, before we go to Councilman Cohen, I want to come back to that office and the structure of it. But before I forget, can we add to the list of requests the presentation that you showed us at the beginning? Make that request number 9, please. Councilman Cohen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Aaron. I actually did want to drill down a little further into that office. One of the things we've learned, I think, from doing the youth fund is that when you give grants, especially to smaller community-based organizations, nonprofits, there's a whole set of technical skills, if not accountants, that are needed, as well as it can be really tough to transition off of those grants, right? So we're talking like a big amount of money. You said minimum $250,000. So could you share a little bit more about how that office or your office is going to help organizations build capacity to be able to effectively spend money, to be able to report it? I assume at some point we probably will be audited for these funds. So how to effectively manage the allocations that organizations are getting, and also how to ultimately transition them off, because it is a finite amount of money and won't go on forever.
Sure. There were several portions of that question, and I want to make sure that I answer each and every one of them. So I will start with the construction or organization of that office. So this is in the agency detail book, I believe, on page 351. We talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan, and just a brief highlight in the budget book as the guidance was still coming out at that time. And it briefly mentions that we are standing up this Office of Recovery Programs, which is the same name given to the office at the Department of Treasury that is managing the American Rescue Plan Act. This office will have about 10 or so people. That includes, and we'll get that information. It's available actually in the agency detail book. The positions that will be in that agency: a director, a deputy director, project managers, budget analysts, accountants, and
Aaron, real quick, where in the book is that?
Page 351, agency detail, volume 1.
Volume 1. For
Mr. Chair,
three-
I don't see it in here.
351,
I believe so.
agency one. Okay. Uh, hold on.
It should be MR, American Rescue Plan Act.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Councilwoman Ramos, again, so we're in volume 1 of the agency detail, mayoralty related American Rescue Plan Act.
I'm looking at it. Thank you. I don't see the
Yep.
actual, oh, there it is, right there in the last bullet. Okay, thanks.
Please continue, Aaron. Sorry for interrupting.
No, absolutely. So there'll be it lists the classifications by city, but there will be various roles by city standards, the classifications. But there will be roles within the office. One to support the chief recovery officer, which will be leading the office, and also opportunities for project managers. In addition to that, the city will have additional consultant support as well to augment the city staff and provide advice and guidance and best practices, in addition to augmenting on project management support as well too. So there will be technical assistance available to applicants to guide them through the process every step of the way. In addition, one of those positions is a program compliance officer, which will be managing the contracts process and making sure we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's along with our agreements, not only with agencies and organizations, but also with the federal treasury as well too. So in addition to that, we also expect there to be additional programs for capacity building, potentially with organizations such as Baltimore Civic Fund. And so I do want to highlight what we think is, for lack of a better word, the brilliance of this application process is not only are we taking in that proposal and saying, yes or no, this is a good idea, it's scored, but when we get to the actual application detailed implementation plan, we're going to work with these organizations to make sure that these operations are sustainable and also scalable, whether that be scaling up or down at a sunset period, and that there are opportunities to ensure that we are fully fleshing out all of the details with organizations that we make agreements with. We want them to have the impact for the city and to change outcomes for residents for good projects. And we want to do our best to make sure that each person in each organization that applies is set up for success in that regard. So that is the mission of this office, to make sure that we're, and I'll go back to my example of a mortgage, a bank making a good deal, not exactly the same, but making sure that we have the details and information to ensure success for each one of these projects and the organizations that are taking them on.
No, thank you for that. And I would just say that I think every penny invested on the front end in that capacity building and project management piece and compliance piece is going to pay off huge down the road. So I think the more, we think and flesh that out up front, I think ultimately it'll behoove us well. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Moore.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, who's this person going to report to?
The city administrator.
Directly?
Yes, I believe so.
So they're not going to be cross-reporting to the director of finance?
No.
Colleagues?
Yes, sir.
To clarify, Mr. Chair, not to my knowledge.
Okay. All right, we've gotten through. Dorsey, I see your hand. You're next up in the queue, but let me make sure we got everyone first. Council Vice President Middleton.
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman McCray?
No questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Schleifer?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Stokes?
No questions.
Thank you. All right, we've cycled through. I'm going to go, then we got Dorsey, then Burnett, Conway, Ramos again. So none of these positions for this office exist yet, correct?
They will exist. They exist in the budget for FY22, but they do not currently exist.
Okay. So when are we gonna start advertising these positions and filling them?
I will defer to the administration on a follow-up for that, but I believe these positions are posted on the city website or have
Oh,
been
they're already posted. Okay.
I
Okay,
believe
good.
decisions are imminent.
So we've got folks presumably who have applied for these positions. They're in the process, right?
Potentially, but I would defer to the administration on the exact specifics. I'm not involved in that process.
Okay.
And just real quick, Mr. Chair, these positions have all gone through BBMR and been approved?
They are in the budget, which is the budget process, which is a part of the process for approving positions.
Yeah, but we've already advertised before the budget was approved, correct?
That is correct, from my understanding. In anticipation of this office being stood up on July 1 because of its critical function to deploy these funds to assist with mitigating the pandemic.
That's correct. This is Daniel Ramos. That's correct, Council President.
So are these positions permanent positions?
No, these are going to be in the model of the grant service specialists, where they will go away when the funding source expires.
Gotcha.
Was there going to be a briefing to the council president or the council on this at some juncture?
We'll coordinate with the Department of Finance and MOGR on getting that set up.
Okay, I think sooner rather than later. Probably this week would be most helpful to better understand this in detail.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Dorsey, Mr. President, did you have anything else, sir?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Dorsey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Aaron, you mentioned in your presentation, and then also in your response to Councilman Conway, the idea of like road resurfacing as an example of something that's probably not going to be covered. But you also did give the example of like the Greenway Trails Network as something where you're kind of looking to see if the needle can be thread one way or the other. And you specifically talked about,
Councilman Dorsey, Dorsey, can I pause you for 1 second?
Yeah.
Marguerite, can you add the city administrator as a panelist? I think Councilman Dorsey, if we could come right back to you in a minute.
No problem.
I appreciate it. I think the city administrator had a response to that previous request. Yep.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair and council members. I've been on and have paid attention closely to the conversation. I did not intend to come on to respond to the question, but just because I don't necessarily have a direct response for when we will be able to do the briefings, but we will certainly make it a priority to do a briefing to all council members who wish to get information on the office that is being stood up. I'll just say of note, and I think that Aaron made this comment very well. We are moving as quickly as we can responsibly to stand up an office as quickly as we can. These funds will be a tremendous blessing to our city, and we want to make sure that we hire responsible and technically proficient executives and professionals into this office. So we are doing that as quickly as we can, but the nature of the budget approval and the creation, if you will, of the temporary positions, we want to make sure that we follow up more formally.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. Councilman Dorsey.
Thanks again, Mr. Chair. So Aaron, you know what I'm getting at. You're talking about kind of maybe being able to thread the needle. And you, in the presentation, you gave a couple of examples of kind of like buckets of priority goals that you might be looking to see if things can fit into. So I guess I'm kind of asking, like a road diet is not, it's not just resurfacing, right? It's not just general infrastructure. It's a specific type of improvement for more equitable access and safety improvements. And, I have in mind, some kind of road diets that would enhance accessibility and attractiveness of local businesses in much the same way the Design for Distancing program has. And I have also others that would create safer access along transit corridors between, bus stops and schools, and between schools and nearby libraries. Things that not only improve safety for children as they are returning to school after a pandemic where traffic has been, even more unsafe than under other normal circumstances. Is this something that we're looking for a way to be able to thread the needle on and justify these kind of not exactly general infrastructure kind of improvements?
I would say I'm not in any position to make a final ruling or determination on projects today, but I would encourage the agency or, in your collaboration with the agency to review the guidance that has been provided not only by the city, but also by the Treasury Department, and also look at the scoring criteria closely to maximizing the potential number of points that the project could receive. I think that is the most apt response that I could provide at this time without making a final determination of such.
Okay, but so as a kind of a category of use, I mean, this is like a transportation safety kind of environment thing. Is that anything that, as you're also, I don't know, maybe it's not you. Somebody's running it up the chain, right? This you're talking about looking to see if something like the Greenway Trails Network is a potentially viable kind of use. Is this other category of thing being kind of looked into as categorically at the same time as something like the Greenway Trails Network?
If the agency makes an application, it will be thoroughly looked into.
Got it. Okay. And I guess that's all I have to ask at this point. Thank you, Aaron.
All right, thank you all. I'm chairing for a second. Councilmember Costello had to step away. So next up on this round, I have Councilmember Conway.
No further questions. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, standing in chair, and to the committee. Two other questions. One is the CARES and the previous federal funding that we've received. It seemed to me in the budget book that it had been allocated under that federal line if we hadn't spent it yet. Do we also, and can we also get a map and a list of all, where the funding is going? I realize rental assistance is a little different because that has been deployed kind of everywhere. And to protect privacy, you can't always do the point in time because it's, very personal. But I'd like to see also, how some of those funds have been allocated, although it's a little different than the ARP funds. And I guess some of it still needs to be spent, correct? The CARES and CAA money?
Yes. So to answer your question, yes, there's, I believe, $52 million of both FEMA and CARES within the FY22 budget. I'd like to highlight that the FEMA funds are anticipated reimbursements. The CARES, we have cash in hand and do expect to spend under whatever's allocated there or outlined within the book. For the ARP or ARPA funds, it really will, there are some direct allocations that we will receive. So as we've discussed, I think previously, there's $1.9 trillion within the law, and it contains a lot of funding for various types of systemic issues and such. And some of those are direct allocations to the city, such as the rental relief and eviction support and support for those experiencing homelessness. There's also additional funding, that may flow through the city over time as additional regulations are written by their respective departments. But this funding, the composition of that will really depend on the projects and applications that are received and evaluated through the process.
Right, I understand that because some of this is very person focused, which is what we needed it to be. So it might be hard to record, but I would like to have some way of reporting of where some of this money went and how it was allocated. And I don't know if we need to make that as a formal request, Mr. Chair, for the CARES money. So I'll leave that up to the chair when he comes back, or Councilman Burnett. And then my second question, you sort of gave me a nice tee up for it. The city did the right thing by investing money in making sure that people experiencing homelessness were put in a safe space quickly, and hoping for the best that there would be funds coming in. And luckily with FEMA money, there is. My understanding is that that could potentially end in September, or at least go into the 70-25 percentages, not fully reimbursable. So would ARP money be available to then make sure that, and then this might be something I need to ask the Maryland Mayor's Office of Homeless Services in their hearing in the next couple of days, but can this money be used to make sure that we actually have more permanent supportive for those who've been housed in the hotels?
So at this time, I do not believe the city has any plan to discontinue any existing operations. However, they may be funded. But as you, of course, noted, that the FEMA reimbursement will decrease from 100% to 75% to 25%, decrease by 25% to 75%, requiring the city to come up with a 25% match of every dollar spent and to be reimbursed. Right now, at this time, it is our understanding of the interim final rule that American Rescue Plan Act funds cannot be used as a city match towards FEMA. However, it appears to me at this time, based on as it is described and potentially in the guidance, that these types of services would be allowed or would be an eligible use under the American Rescue Plan Act in full if the city decides to pursue that method. However, I think these things are still under consideration by the Department of Finance when it comes to strategy and the best way to maximize city funds or leverage federal funds for these purposes. But to reiterate, I do not think there is any discussion, to my knowledge at this time, to discontinue any of these services, no matter how they're funded.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. And just so I got it, what was you had a formal request you wanted to submit? I want to make sure we got
I
it.
wanted to get a report out of how the CARES money and the additional money had been spent and is planning on. I can tell where it's planning on being spent because it's in the budget book, but I don't know where, if we could get a formal reporting of that at some point.
Okay. Marguerite has that coming down. We're good. Oh, Nina has it. We're good. Sorry, just taking over now. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember.
Thank you.
Councilmember Cohen.
No, I'm good, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
You're good. Good. Okay. I'm gonna go back around in no particular order to see if anyone else has questions. Councilmember Glover.
No, I'm good, Councilmember Knight. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Councilmember McCray.
No questions. Thank you.
No question. Council President Mosby.
I'm good, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
All right. Councilmember Stokes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for Mr. Moore. Councilman Odette just talking about it. Because we talk about homeless in the city, but we never talk about permanent housing for them. Some of this ARP money, even if it's not a particular building, can it be used for construction in terms of finding locations and make sure, like, we're doing a partnership with Healthcare for the Homeless, and they building new construction over in Oliver for permanent housing for those persons who are ready to kind of live on their own. Can some of this money be used for that particular kind of project that we're doing over in Oliver also?
It appears to me that, as described by you currently, that would potentially be an eligible use. However, I would add the caveat that these funds are time limited, so construction projects, we definitely want to ensure that we're meeting those requirements by the Treasury Department. In addition to that, I do want to also continue to highlight that the state will be receiving $170 million in capital project funds from this law as well. That may filter down to Baltimore, and those funds do not expire. In addition to that, the state will also be receiving $4 billion allocation of its own, which is also time limited, that may be filtering down to the city in various ways. In addition to that, there are various provisions to help our citizens that are experiencing homelessness that are direct and will be provided to the city that agencies are actively looking into at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Stokes. We've been rejoined by Chairman Costello. Chairman, I was just going through the list to see if anyone else had any other questions. Councilmember Dorsey, do you have another round? Sorry, I'm just going down the list.
All good. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. I do see Chairman Costello has questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Aaron, on the positions in the new office, those positions are going to be funded with ARP funding, correct?
That is correct. That is part of the 10.6 million allocation that we reserve for administration over the course of the funding over the next 3.5 or 4 fiscal years.
Okay. And then there's an understanding that those positions will go away after the funding is fully expended, correct?
Yes, they are tied to that funding source.
Okay. Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Council Vice President Middleton, did you have any more questions?
I'm good, thank you.
I guess you're muted. I didn't hear any say anything. Okay. And Councilmember Slifer?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, I think that's everybody.
Mr. Chair.
Sorry. Councilmember Conway?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry, I just had one more quick question. I know we're actually closing out 2021 and we have used some funds to sort of balance out the budget. Is there any expectation that more ARP funds will do so for 2021, affecting future funding?
So we have set aside a total of 141 million, which includes the administration and budget stabilization. So using, the amount of that 130 specifically for budget stabilization will leave us with reserves for future years to tap into. And, hopefully that we are able to continue to employ these funds quickly and expeditiously and make an impact. And also nationally, that we are making a recovery so that we will no longer need those funds set aside and can send them back into projects. That is the hope. But 130 million, 30.6 to be exact, has been set aside specifically to close out fiscal years due to revenue losses.
So to sort of refine that point, so we don't expect to go over $130 million for this fiscal year?
Not at this time.
Okay.
Just 50 for this fiscal year for 21.
I see. And 80 for the next.
That's correct.
Got it. Thank you. That's all my questions.
One other question on the position, or actually just on the ARP funding. The law says that that under half of the money needs to be distributed to the city within 1 year, meaning we get at least 50% plus one upfront, and then the other 50% comes within a year. Is that correct? What's the specific timing on that? And did I characterize that correctly?
Yeah, we actually received the, excuse me, we received the half, which is $320 million or so. We actually received it on Friday.
Okay, so then a year from Friday, we're due the other half, correct?
Yeah, we'll get another wire for the remaining.
Okay, and then in terms of the budget as presented, do we have an issue that we have 680 in here when it's only going to be 640?
So yeah, when we put the budget together, or when the due date was there for the final budget, we still thought we were getting the 670,
right.
So we put the full appropriation in. That appropriation just lapses if we don't use it in that year, so we don't see that as an issue. It is extra appropriation beyond what we will receive, but in grant funds, we only spend up to what we receive, so it's extra appropriation that will lapse at the end of that fiscal year.
That's what I figured. I just wanted to make sure. Okay. Colleagues, any other questions? Aaron, Bob, thanks for all of your hard work on this. Really appreciate it. We are now in recess until 2:30 when we have the mayor's Office of Performance and Innovation. Thank you.